You love her voice, you love her looks. What Melissa loves comic books. Hi, and welcome back. So, I had 32 views on my last episode. So, what am I going to do this time to bring my numbers up? I'm going to talk about Moon Mullins and Winnie Winkle. And also Terry and the Pirates, because although we've talked about it before, I don't think we've really given it its due. All three of those features were features in Super Comics, which was published by Western Comics for 5 years from 1938 to 1943. So let's look at my notes and see what I have to say about them. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. We've covered a lot of the bigger name properties Dell Comics shared with their partner business, Western Comics, and this included the big names in comic strips in 1938, from Dick Tracy to Little Orphan Annie to the Gumps. And they were all featured in Super Comics, leaving Dell's titles to be filled with less popular strips. It was an interesting strategy, to say the least. Instead of splitting up the big names to headline each title, anyway, I've already talked about a lot of those big name strips, but Moon Mullins and Winnie Winkle are, while not household names today, certainly comic strips with significant histories, lasting in newspapers for 68 and 76 years respectively. They were also both still in the Chicago Tribune when I was still growing up, leaving me fond nostalgia for both titles, and I'll share my impression of the strips as I remember them. The longevity of Moon Mullins was remarkable because none of us growing up in the 1970s and 1980s had any experience with living in a boarding house, which the entire cast of Moon Mullins did. The boarding house on Wump Street, perhaps a not subtle dig against the Gumps, seemed resistant to the passing of time, as if it were always the 1920s or maybe the 1930s there. The title character, Moon Mullins, was a prize fighter, and while Joe Palooka, debuting 7 years later, would show us what life was like for a hugely successful boxer, Moon Mullins was always just scraping by. Of course, this was what huge swaths of the population were already doing in the 1920s. The Schmaltz boarding house represented a Jewish ghetto in a city like New York City, but the residents were a mix of Jews and Gentiles, representing the working poor, the unemployed, and the just down on their luck. Frank Willard was born in Illinois and attended the Academy of Fine Arts in Chicago, but intended the whole time to become a cartoonist. For 9 years, he labored on strips that just weren't gaining traction with the public. The story about the creation of Moon Mullins goes like this. Willard was working on his third strip for King Features Syndicate, the Out of Luck Club, when he learned that a mole at the syndicate was stealing his ideas and giving them to George McManus, the creator of the very popular strip Bringing Up Father. Willard, then a still feisty 29-year-old, confronted the older McManus and popped him one in the face. Joe Patterson, the publisher and boss of both of these men, could have fired Willard on the spot, but didn't. Patterson figured that any ideas that were so good that Willard was willing to beat someone up over them must be good ideas, and he better hear what the rest of those ideas were. So he allowed Willard to come in and pitch an idea for a new comic strip, and that became Moon Mullins. That story may or may not be entirely true. The strip moved in the opposite direction of so many strips, away from extended story arcs focused on Moon Mullins and towards becoming a gag-a-day strip that it was when I was growing up. It was more focused when I was growing up on K.O., Moon's tiny kid brother, and Lord Plushbottom, the down-on-his-luck English aristocrat who fell for and married Emma Schmaltz and took over running the boarding house from her. The gags played on the differences and similarities between these two very different characters, and it was never laugh-out-loud funny, but it had a sense of whimsy to it, and I've always liked whimsy. Moon reached an impressive 350 newspapers at its circulation peak, while its popularity peak was the late 1930s and 1940s, when it branched out into both radio and merchandising. The strip is best remembered today for K.O. powdered chocolate that once bore the image of K.O. from the strip on every package. Winnie Winkle, the breadwinner, later just Winnie Winkle, also owed its existence to Joe Patterson, though it lacks a funny, violent backstory. Patterson thought there should be a strip about an independent young woman supporting her family, a situation a lot of families experienced during World War I, something that may have helped secure women the right to vote in 1920, the same year that Winnie Winkle debuted. He assigned the idea to Martin Branner, an ex-vaudeville dancer, World War I vet, whose only previous strip was Louis the Lawyer, and that continued as a topper for the Winnie Winkle strip for years. This was not the first comic strip about an independent young woman in the workplace. That would be Somebody's Stenog, which debuted the year before. But that was a very different, very cartoony feature, and this one would be more realistic and serious. Winnie Winkle was given the grace, poise, and good looks of Branner's wife and former vaudeville dance partner, Edith. But she's still a stenographer, just like the previous comic strip. What else are you going to have a woman do in a comic strip without offending the conservative readers? Edith was allegedly a strong contributor to the strip, designing Winnie's fashions herself. Her family expanded that same year, Winnie's, not Edith's, when she gained an adopted brother who was actually her little cousin, Perry Winkle. Perry Winkle became a co-star of the strip and the star of every Sunday page because his juvenile hijinks with his friends lent to more comedy than Winnie did. She also gained some girlfriends, but most of the new cast over the next 12 years of the strip were the rotating boyfriends, courting Winnie, enough that a board game came out in 1932 that let you play Winnie trying to cross the board before any of the suitors caught her. Things had taken a darker, more melodramatic turn for Winnie starting in 1928, and then following years as she lost that stenographer job, she pursued some work in Hollywood and then tried many jobs while failing to hold any of them for long. She was even briefly a secret agent for the government, asked to help identify a spy. Because the Winnie Winkle strips, reprinted in Super Comics, were 2 years behind the current strips in syndication, Winnie was not yet married in these pages. That surprisingly fast courtship and marriage happened in 1937 after she met William Wright, literally Mr. Wright, and not long after Cornelius Cutting proposed marriage to her first. Winnie Winkle was hugely popular in its day. It actually didn't appear in very many newspapers, 150 compared to Moon Mullins' 350, but it appeared in big circulation ones, and overseas. Perry Winkle was hugely popular in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands, who had no interest in the Winnie Winkle storylines and just wanted Perry's Sunday pages. Winnie Winkle was the first American strip published in Yugoslavia. There were 11 silent movies starring Winnie Winkle, well, actresses playing Winnie Winkle, in the late 1920s. Winnie Winkle was a hugely different strip by the time that I was reading it in the Chicago Tribune. Spoilers, Bill Wright died and left Winnie a widow, and the strip became more realistic and even more soap opera as the years went by. Like a soap opera, Bill would come back from the dead, only to die again, I think twice. I don't remember anything else about the storylines I read. They left no impression on me other than that the art was decent, and I thought the names Winnie Winkle and Perry Winkle didn't fit the seriousness of the strip, and now I finally understand why. I have certainly talked about the creator, Milt Caniff, before, and I devoted an entire episode to his first creation, Dickie Dare, but in 1934, Milt left Dickie Dare in other hands and began a new strip, Terry and the Pirates. I have also described Terry and the Pirates before, comparing and contrasting it to Dickie Dare, and mentioned its strengths and weaknesses. To summarize, the reason Terry and the Pirates is remembered today more than Dickie Dare is sex, specifically Caniff's skill at drawing the opposite sex, voluptuous women. While Dickie's guardian, Dan Flynn, had his female admirers, Terry Lee's guardian, Pat Ryan, attracted suitors as rapidly as Winnie Winkle did, only Pat suitors gave men boners. And I'm not just saying that to be funny. During World War II, our armed forces had strict codes of conduct for not having nudity or pornography in the barracks, so pinups like drawings of Milt Caniff's characters were monkey spanking material for the mini soldiers. This is historical fact. And there was something else Kniff thought Dickie Dare was missing, a steady comic relief presence. And that's how we got Connie. No, not this Connie, this Connie. George Webster Confucius was first hired as a guide by Pat Ryan and Terry Lee, but he quickly became an equal partner in their adventures, even though his true passion was always cooking and his dream of opening his own restaurant would happen later in the storylines. You can try to look past the broken English and the obvious racist caricature and say that this was just normal for its time, and sometimes Connie was just as brave as Pat and Terry, but more often than not was portrayed as stereotypically cowardly and superstitious, as all Asians were in these strips. Terry and the Pirates, just like Moon Mullins and Winnie Winkle, were some of the first features that were included in Dell's Popular Comics, which launched in 1936, before they transferred over to Super Comics in 1938. Now, the first page of Moon Mullins was a Sunday page that you saw in the first issue of Popular Comics, and that focused on Moon's Uncle Willie and Aunt Mamie trying to bring home a live pig that was gifted to Willie as a birthday present. The first page of Winnie Winkle was a Sunday page focused on Periwinkle sitting in a dentist's office, not because he's got an appointment, but because he wants to read the magazines in the waiting room. That first installment of Terry and the Pirates picked up right after a story where Pat and Terry put the skids under Fang the Pirate and helped the Dragon Lady to escape. Pat and Terry and Connie were then taking a plane to Peking to meet their archaeologist friend Dr. McAndrews, along with a fellow American Sherry Granger, who is on her way to see her father who runs a mine near Peking. Their plane is forced to land early by another passenger who works for another pirate, but this one wears a skull mask. He never tells them what to call him, but Pat starts calling him the Skull, and that's a pretty good name for a villain. We'll have very many variations on that over the years to come. The Skull has Sherry's dad a prisoner, and he's going to torture him or his daughter until one of them writes a letter to her father's company demanding a large ransom for them. 6 months later, the Skull was already defeated, and Pat and Terry were captives of the Dragon Lady again. She was holding them in her monastery-turned-fortress as hostages in case the American Navy came after her. By 6 months later, the Dragon Lady had already been defeated by rival pirate Captain Blaze, who then took the boys and the Dragon Lady prisoner. 6 months later, the Dragon Lady's forces rally, rescue her, take Captain Blaze prisoner, but Pat, Terry, and Connie hole up in his fortress and defend it against the Dragon Lady. But badly outnumbered as they are, they can't hold out long, and soon they're the Dragon Lady's prisoners again. About 8 months later, before Superman debuted, Terry and the Pirates made their last appearance in Popular Comics. The Chinese government has defeated the Dragon Lady and her forces and plans to put them all to death, but they mistakenly think Pat and Terry and Connie were also pirates. Captain Blaze, who earlier escaped, shows up with fake credentials and saves them. When Pat, Terry, and Connie return in Super Comics, it is their Sunday pages from September and October 1936 being reprinted, and issue number 2 introduced yet another new villain, Papa Paisan. Our heroes are, you guessed it, prisoners again. At least this villain is different. He is a bandit and not a pirate. Our heroes are saved again by the Dragon Lady, who lures Paisan's men away with the promise of women in issue number 4. As of issue number 5, the daily strips were added, and this was very rare with any comic strip reprints. Usually the dailies or the Sundays would get reprinted, but not both, which led to situations I've complained about before on past episodes where information is missing for readers who never got to read them in the newspapers. By issue number 8, a new kind of villain has finally been introduced into the strip. Tony Sandhurst is a corporate pirate, an American businessman with no scruples and married to an old flame of Pat's, Normandy Drake. The boys are still dealing with Sandhurst in the last issue of Super Comics for 1938. In that same issue, Moon Mullins is upset because his girlfriend has been fired from the nightclub she works at, a nightclub that is currently owned and operated by Lord Plushbottom, temporarily back on his feet financially. Very temporarily, as thieves make off with the nightclub safe that Uncle Willie was guarding. At this time, storylines were still going on um, in Moon Mullins. It was not Gag a Day Strip yet. In Winnie Winkle, Winnie is between jobs and so is her friend Fanny Fitz. They show up at an office to ask for a job, but because they're just standing around chatting, when the boss shows up, he assumes they work there and are being lazy, so he tries to fire them and tells them to go collect their last 2 weeks' pay. When Winnie's pa hears about this, he thinks this is a great scheme to make money, to show up in offices and try to get fired. But when he tries it, he's thrown out of the private office that he sneaks into. Wah wah. And that is where we're going to leave off with today's episode. We'll see more of what's coming out in 1938 in follow-up episodes to this before we wrap back around to talking about Superman. And I hope that you stay with me for all of them, that you liked and subscribed to this if you haven't already. And I hope to see you then. Bye-bye.